Hey everybody, tonight's video is called Parable of Two Egos, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Ezekiel, where we're going to be looking at the next parable involving the two egos in a vine. And this was likely delivered sometime between the dates given of Ezekiel chapter 8 verse 1 and Ezekiel chapter 20 verse 1, the 6 and 7 years of the exile of King Jehoiachin between 592 to 590 BC. And so King Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to Jerusalem in 587 BC, and he removes King Zedekiah from the throne in 586 BC. And so in the 17th chapter of the book of Ezekiel, verse 1 and 2, it opens up, "And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, pose a riddle, and speak a parable to the house of Israel." So this chapter takes place 2 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. And the history takes place in the book of 2 Kings chapter 24, and the book of 2 Chronicles chapter 36, and Jeremiah chapters 36, 37, and Jeremiah 52. And God refers to Israel as a whole. In verse 3 it says, "And say, Thus says the Lord God, a great eagle with large wings and large pinions, full of feathers with various colors, came to Lebanon, and took from the cedar, the highest branch." So a great eagle represents the king of Babylon in view here, took royal captives and others. And the cedar is the kingdom of Judah. And the eagle often in the Old Testament symbolizes God's punitive power as seen in Deuteronomy 28, verse 49. And in verse 4, he cropped out its topmost young twig and carried it to a land of trade. He set it in a city of merchants. So this speaks of King Jehoiachin, exiled in 597 BC, seen back in 2 Kings 24, verse 11 through 16. And so Babylon is a land of trade. In verse 5 and 6, "Then he took some of the seed of the land and planted it into a fertile field. He placed it by abundant waters and set it like a willow tree. And it grew and became a spreading vine of low stature. Its branches turned toward him, but its roots were under it. So it became a vine, brought forth branches, and put forth shoots." So the seed was those whom Babylon left in Judah in 597 BC, who could prosper as a tributary to the conqueror turned toward him. And a spreading vine refers to King Zedekiah, the youngest son of Josiah, whom Nebuchadnezzar appointed king in Judah. And the benevolent attitude of Nebuchadnezzar helped Zedekiah to prosper. And if he had remained faithful to his pledge of King Nebuchadnezzar, Judah would have continued as a tributary kingdom. Instead, he began courting up help from Egypt, as seen in 2 Chronicles 36, verse 13, which Jeremiah protested in Jeremiah 37, verse 5 through 7. And so verse 7 and 8 says, "But there was another eagle with large wings and many feathers, and behold, this vine bent its roots toward him, and it stretched its branches toward him from the garden terrace where it had been planted, that he might water it. It was planted in good soil by many waters to bring forth branches, bear fruit, and become a majestic vine." So another great ego is Egypt, represented specifically Pharaoh Apres, aka Hophra, from 588 to 568 BC. And we see that Zedekiah turned to him to help revolt against Babylon. In verse 9 and 10, "Thus says the Lord God, will it thrive? Will he not pull up its roots, cut off its fruit, and leave it to wither? All of its springs leaves will wither, and no great power or many people will be needed to pluck it up by its roots. Behold, it is planted. Will it thrive? will it not utterly wither when the east wind touches it. I will wither in the garden terrace where it grew. So Zedekiah's treachery would not prosper, and the king was captured in the plains of Jericho in Jeremiah 52, verse 8. And the dependence on Egypt would fail, and Judah would wither as the east wind, as a picture of Babylon blasted her. And God asks a rhetorical question, revealing the fate of the vine. And a big chunk of the passage here, verses 11 through 21, says, Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Say now to the rebellious house, do you not know what these things mean? Tell them indeed, the king of Babylon went to Jerusalem, and took its princes and kings, and led them with him to Babylon. And he took the king's offspring, made a covenant with them, and put them under oath. He took away the mighty of the land, that the kingdom might be brought low, and not lift itself up, but that by keeping his covenant it might stand. But he rebelled against him by sending his ambassadors to Egypt, that they might give him horses and many people. Will he prosper? Will he who does such a thing escape? Can he break a covenant and still be delivered? As I live, says the Lord, surely in the place where the king dwells, who made him king, whose oath he despised, and whose covenant he broke with him in the midst of Babylon, he shall die. Nor will Pharaoh with his mighty army and great company do anything in the war when they heap a siege mound and build a wall to cut off many persons. Since he despised the oath by breaking the covenant, and in fact gave his hand, and still did all these things, he did not escape. Therefore thus says the Lord God, as I live, surely my oath which he despised, and my covenant which he broke, I will recompense on my own head. I will spread my net over him, and he shall be taken in my snare. And I will bring him to Babylon, and try them there, for the treason which he committed against me. And all his fugitives with all his troops shall fall by the sword, and those who remain shall be scattered to every wind. And you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken. So, the parable here is explained in detail. And Babylon made Zedekiah a vassal subject to her, took captives, and left Judah weak. And Zedekiah broke the agreement in which he swore by the Lord to submit to Babylon in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 13, and sought Egypt's help. Thus he was taken to Babylon to live out his life. And Egypt was to be no help to him or any protector of his army. And Lebanon represented Jerusalem. And ego is used also as a symbol of Babylon in Jeremiah chapter 48 verse 40, Jeremiah 49 verse 22, and Daniel chapter 7 verse 4. And just as a reminder, my friend Brian Peckham is doing a study through the book of Daniel on Facebook Live every Saturday. And he'll be actually hitting on chapter 7, I believe, this week or next week. And that's at 12 p.m., I think. But as mentioned before, Zedekiah died in Babylon, as shown in 2 Kings 25, verse 7, shows he watched his sons die before his eyes were gouged out. And we've talked about him a few times throughout our trip of the Old Testament, and it's devastating to think about watching your children killed right in front of you, and then having your your vision taken away with your eyes gouged out. It's a horrific thought to think of. But Zedekiah in Jeremiah 52 verse 6 through 9, and other high-ranking men of the government tried to escape when the Babylonians came against Jerusalem. And they did not succeed, as God had spread his net over him. And when Zedekiah broke his covenant with the king of Babylon, he also committed treason against Yahweh himself. And there would be no recovery from the fall of Zedekiah's reign, and Judea would be completely conquered. And to verse 22 and 23, thus says the Lord God, I will take also one of the highest branches of the high cedar, and set it out. I will crop off from the topmost of its young twigs. a tender one, and will plant it on a high and prominent mountain. On the mountain height of Israel I will plant it, and it will bring forth boughs or whatever that word is, and bear fruit in a majestic cedar. Under it will dwell birds of every sort. In the shadow of its branches they will dwell. So here is a messianic prophecy stating that God will provide the Messiah from the line of King David, the high cedar, and establish him in his kingdom like the mountain, as seen in Daniel chapter 2 verse 35 and Daniel chapter 2 verse 44 through 45. And he will be a high branch reigning in the height of success. And branch is another name for Messiah that we know. If you were with us in our Isaiah study last fall, actually it was like last spring into the fall, in Isaiah chapter 11. But branch is also used in Ezekiel and Zedekiah as well. So the Messiah will be a tender one, grown into a majestic cedar. And under his kingdom rule, all the nations will be blessed and Israel will be restored. In verse 24, to finish the chapter, it says, "And all the trees of the field shall know that I, the Lord, have brought down the high tree, and exalted the low tree, dried up the green tree, and made the dry tree flourish. I, the Lord, have spoken and have done it." So the Messiah will grow out of the dry tree left after humbling judgment. And Judah's remnant, from which he came, of a lowly family, as seen in Isaiah 6:13, yet would prosper. And God would exalt himself from among the nations. And as we wrap up the chapter here, it began with judgment and punishment, and we see that it ends with mercy and grace, with a messianic prophecy pointing us to Christ to come. And it opens with a riddle and parable of the two egos. And verse 3 through 6 shows that the first ego spoken of in the parable. Verse 7 and 8 shows the second ego of the parable. And then verse 9 through 10 gives us God's observations upon this vine. Verse 11 through 15 shows us the meaning of the parable of these two egos. In verse 16 through 18 shows God's estimation of Zedekiah. And verse 19 through 21 shows God's promise to capture Zedekiah. And the chapter ends with the hope and the promise of restoration. Now I want to look at John chapter 15, verse 4 through 8. So talking about the vine, it points us to Christ, the branch. And John 15, verse 4 through 8 says, "Abide in me and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me, and I in him, bears much fruit. For without me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is cast out as a branch and is withered, and they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they are burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, you will ask what you desire, and it shall be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, so you will be my disciples." So Jesus is the vine, and we are the branches. And we'll wrap this up right here, as we'll see you next, looking at the responsibility of the individual soul. So that should be on Friday, if I recall. And I hope that you have a great rest of your week. God bless.